Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today's a big video. We're doing the 2021 astrology forecast. First off, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons. You will get this forecast early, and it'll be released to the general public sometime around January 1st. If you would like to join my patrons, please feel free. It's at patreon.com/NinaGriffin. And you'll get access not only to videos that are released early to patrons, but also videos that are only exclusively ever available to patrons. All right, now let's get started. This is going to be the big one. Now, the story of 2021 is kind of interesting because in some ways it resembles and carries some of the same themes that we saw in 2020, which makes sense, right? Not everything is resolved by any means. So 2021 kind of picks up some of the same themes that 2020 did and then does slightly different things with them. So let me kind of give you the whole narrative of the year, just very, very high level, the quick story, and you'll see what I mean. So if anything, the first quarter of the year, the first 3 months of 2021, tell us that there's going to be an ongoing struggle between destruction and conservation, as I like to call it. This is going to really continue, but it'll be on a much larger playing field, if you can imagine. So if you saw struggles occurring in your country between these two forces of destruction and conservation, it's going to be happening kind of internationally now. So it's going to be like we sort of take a very, very big step back and sort of watch it happen all over the globe. In 2020, this was really symbolized by Mars square Saturn and their protracted square that really lasted for 6 months. In 2021, Saturn is once again involved in a similar battle, but it's going to be Saturn versus Uranus, who are going to be in square. Still, I would encourage you to think a little bit beyond the usual roles of Saturn and Uranus. As I always say, the revolutionaries are not the people that you may think. Instead of looking to the labels that people call themselves, I think we'll have a much better chance of understanding how Saturn and Uranus will play out if we look at people's actual stated positions and actions and goals to determine which planet they represent. You know, do they really want to change the status quo and destroy institutions, or are they trying to strengthen institutions? You know, Saturn, I think, in general, is better positioned for victory between Saturn and Uranus due to Saturn being in his own sign and being in a superior square to Uranus. Now, the second quarter of the year is a little bit, to me, like the spring of 2020. There's some euphoria and even hysteria going on, with everyone demanding to be, free from restrictions of all kinds. Certainly lockdowns of COVID come to mind, but really any kind of constraints. I think that we're going to see a lot of discussion in the spring, a lot of social media excitement and campaigns and all that kind of stuff, maybe protests. I think it's going to be kind of a breath of fresh air. Now, whether or not that actually is a good idea in the long term. The third quarter is very different. So this is, kind of as we get into late summer and then fall. I call third quarter the season of the reality check. It's really going to be looking at the facts and then getting back to work. So our task of rebuilding a normal world after everything that happened in 2020 will not yet be done. And so this time will be the period of realization that more work still remains to be done. The last quarter of the year is going to be interesting, kind of in, similarly to what we saw in Q4 of 2020. This is when we definitely return to rebuilding, but there's a little bit more hope. And there's definitely still disagreement over what is rebuilt and what those new structures and edifices look like. And I think we're even going to get some of the same protest vibes that we saw in the first half of the year, in the second quarter. But there is still the sense that we are turning a corner for a much better 2022. So overall, I would say that 2021 is definitely better than 2020. But as I have said in previous articles as well as videos, 2021 is kind of an unsettled time. You know, it's not like someone's going to flip a switch and then suddenly everything will go back to normal. I think of 2021 as being more of a negotiation and discussion, and in some cases, arguments and conflicts over what that normal is going to look like. We're going to be getting closer and closer to it, but it's a negotiated state rather than an existing state that we just have to revert back to. So first, let's review the major aspects of 2021. Saturn's going to be square Uranus. That's kind of the really big thing. February 17th, June 14th, and December 23rd. The thing about this aspect is that it's an aspect of conflict between reactionary and revolutionary forces. And I think sometimes writers, astrological writers, do it a little bit of a disservice because they always assume that Saturn is the sort of conservative side of whatever political spectrum you want to imagine, and Uranus are like the crazy, wild-eyed liberal revolutionaries. But I don't think that's always the case, actually. I think that, as I said in my introduction, it's much more important to think about this as Saturn being the people who want to take existing institutions and maybe improve them, right? But fundamentally preserve them. Whereas Uranus are the people saying, burn it all down. So that doesn't really have a lot to do with who is on the right wing or left wing. It's really more of a general position that you take with respect to the status quo. Now, Jupiter will square Uranus himself as well, but just once, not 3 times like Saturn. It's going to be on January 17th. And this is an important aspect when it comes to collective activity. I would consider it a very brilliant aspect of intense liberation that we end up fighting about basically for the rest of the year. If you want a mythological analogy to this one, this is the moment when Prometheus steals fire from the gods on Olympus, which is this really audacious act that was never supposed to happen, but the point of it is to better the lives of humanity. And so Saturn square Uranus is then the conflict that results from Jupiter square Uranus, right? So you can think of a lot of what happens in January as kind of a catalyst for what is discussed and then negotiated the rest of the year. Mars himself will make 2 hard aspects to Neptune out of the 3 of the mutable or double signs, as I call them. He will make a square April 9th in opposition to September 2nd. And here's, I think, what's even more important. Mars will make 3 hard aspects to Uranus this year. It'll be January 20th, which is a conjunction, July 3rd, and November 17th, out of the 3 of the fixed signs. So, of course, Uranus will be in Taurus the whole year, and Mars, whenever he gets into a fixed sign, which will be 3 times this year because he's so fast, he's going to make a hard aspect to Uranus. And so he's going to trigger some of that conflict, that discussion between the people who want status quo, or what I would call status quo plus, status quo improved, versus Uranus, which is just like Godzilla, burn it all down kind of thing. The other thing that's interesting this year, from an aspect perspective, is that Mercury and Venus will conjoin 4 times this year, which is a lot. It'll happen in February, April, May, and then December. So if these 2 planets are important for you, maybe they're your profected Lord or Lady of the year, it's going to be kind of an intense Mercury-Venus interchange, really, all of this year. Let's talk about Saturn square Uranus. And I mentioned this in my Saturn in Aquarius video as well, so you may want to review that. So Saturn in Aquarius will square Uranus in Taurus in February, June, and December of 2021. Now, I'm thinking about this from a global perspective because even though I'm a traditional astrologer, I do look at the outer planets, but really mostly as they impact the collective. So when you're trying to understand trends or political events or generational trends, the outer planets definitely have a role. I still give them kind of a secondary role compared to the visible planets, but I definitely don't entirely ignore them, as you can tell. The late mundane astrologer André Barbeau calls this particular combination, the Saturn-Uranus cycle, dry, hard, taut, neither hot nor cold, enlisting ambition, a thirst for conquest, extremist aspirations, ventures that go to the limits, authoritarian power, the longest and most lasting reign. Now, it's sort of an interesting combination of factors that he lists there. The longest and most lasting reign has to do with the fact that it's Saturn and Uranus, who were the two old Titan kings of Greek mythology. So their reigns were supposed to have lasted much, much longer than our current age, which is presided over by Zeus, who of course is their child. Now, the conjunctions between Saturn and Uranus, according to André Barbeau, represent periods when the competing interest of the great powers were at their height, and that's a quote. The most recent conjunction between these two planets was in 1988, and before that, 1942. Both of these periods, as I'm sure you know, meant that there were very, very big changes happening really worldwide. These were not necessarily changes that occurred from one day to the next, but of course the late 80s and early 90s saw the end of communism and the end of the USSR, and of course the early 1940s and then the mid-1940s saw a complete realignment of power in Europe and really worldwide as a result of World War II. So we are kind of in this cycle. We're not at the beginning or at the end. We're at a square, but it is a time when you get a lot of intense competition and even conflict between the big, big powers of the world, certainly what you would call the empires of the world. Now, Rick Tarnas, in a follow-up that he did to Cosmos and Psyche, his book, he mentions this about the Saturn-Uranus opposition, which occurred 2007 to 2011, according to him. He gives it a really wide orb. And this is an entire quote. Sudden unexpected problematic events, crises, and schisms, a taut conflict between the conservative and liberal or progressive, the reactionary and the radical, authority and rebellion, stability and disruption. I think that's the most accurate one, in my view. Change and the resistance to change, freedom and repression, the old and the young, highly polarized societies and politics, protests, strikes, crackdowns, and civil unrest. He sees it as a cycle of extreme liberty or permissiveness followed by an extreme crackdown. He also noted that the 2008 presidential election occurred on a Saturn-Uranus opposition, and he sees it as a period of extreme change from a very conservative to a more centrist, I would say, approach, but it's kind of a pendulum swinging thing, right? So whereas I guess for 2008, we saw it as a pretty big change from a conservative administration in the United States to a more liberal administration, right, of Obama. Certainly it's a period of generational and class conflict. And he also mentions the possibility of highly consequential mistakes and flaws, as well as transportation accidents and the derivative meltdown in 2009 that helped tank the global economy. Now, I would point out in 2021 that within a month of each of those Saturn-Uranus ingresses, Mars will also make a hard aspect to Uranus, so perhaps kind of constellating and concentrating the Saturn-Uranus aspect, right? Mars acting as a bit of a trigger, as he so often does. Mars will conjoin Uranus in January, he will square Uranus in July, and oppose Uranus in November 2021, triggering almost the same degree that Saturn hits, earlier or later. I think that these months and these periods will mark very strong tensions and some kind of engagements between the great powers of this world. I think it could be tough on the financial and equity markets. Certainly it could make them more volatile during these times. My expectation, as far as COVID is concerned, is that Saturn square Uranus will represent peaks in the COVID-19 cases, as was also the case in the 1918 influenza epidemic, when Saturn opposed Uranus 5 times starting in 1918 until the middle of 1920. So really it was like 2 years plus. In comparison, in 2021 we'll be in much better shape. We will have only 3 squares instead of 5, and it will take less than 1 year. So it's not to be, something that's trifled with, but I think we're also getting off a lot easier than people were in 1918. There will also be a few important retrogrades that I think are important to mention and to discuss. So this is in my personal order of importance. Venus will be retrograde on December 19th at 26 Capricorn, And as I think we've all noticed by this point, Venus retrograde has everything to do with racial and religious harmony and justice. It's not so much that Venus herself is the instrument of justice, but I think of her as facilitating or desiring justice as a means to peace. Saturn retrograde will be May 23rd at 13 degrees Aquarius, and he'll turn direct October 10th at 6 Aquarius. Jupiter will go retrograde June 20th at 2 Pisces, and then direct October 17th at 22 Aquarius. Mercury will be retrograde in all the air signs, right? Aquarius, Gemini, and then Libra. So that's going to be, I think, a very interesting year given how charged up Aquarius already is with the presence of Jupiter and Saturn. We'll talk more about what these retrogrades mean in the context of the different parts of the year. Now, as far as major ingresses go, I think we'll have quite a few really interesting sort of things going on here. Saturn himself will not be making any sign changes. He'll be hanging out between basically 1 Aquarius and 12 Aquarius. So if you have any sensitive points in those first 12 or so degrees of fixed signs, you'll feel it. By the way, this also includes your natal lot of fortune and lot of daimon. So if you know where those are in your natal chart, see if Saturn is making a major aspect, and I mean basically conjunction and opposition to one or both of these. Now, Jupiter will be doing some interesting stuff this year. He'll be moving between 2 Aquarius and 2 Pisces, and he will spend a little bit of time in Pisces from mid-May to July, basically. At that point, he'll come back to Aquarius and then get back to Pisces at the end of the year. This is going to be most positive if you have air sign or very early water sign placements. We'll again talk about the meaning of Jupiter changing signs in a minute. Mars is going to be very fast this year. He'll start out at 27 Aries and ends at 12 Scorpio. So no one sign will get Mars for very long, but pretty much everyone will get some Mars passing through an important sign in their chart. Venus will be spending a protracted amount of time in Capricorn, November and December, and then of course some of January as well, because she is going to be retrograde in that sign near Christmas. I think that Venus retrograde in December is going to be the opportunity to heal some of those wounds, I think, from 2020, those Capricorn wounds that we've all experienced, which may feel like ancient history, but it's still going to be with us probably for the rest of our lives in some form. Now, as I said earlier, Mercury will spend a lot of time in the air signs, 2 months each in Aquarius, Gemini, and Libra. So this is especially important if Mercury is your profected Lord of the Year in 2021 or is otherwise prominent for you. You're going to be spending a lot of time in the world of air, of ideas, concepts, learning, language, all those things. There is, I think, I wanted to make a special shout out to Neptune, which I don't usually do, but I think it's worthwhile. He's going to be transiting basically 18 Pisces, and then he's going to go through all the way up to 23 Pisces and then go back to 20. The reason that this is important is that according to Louise McWhirter, who was a brilliant economist and stock market forecaster of the early part of the 20th century, the midheaven of the New York Stock Exchange is 24 Pisces. And her book says the following: no planet has ever passed over the midheaven of the New York Stock Exchange or in opposition to it without indicating a change in the major trend of business and stock market prices. And she notes that the last time, she was writing in the 1930s, the last time this transit happened was in 1861, during the so-called Secession Depression, which marked the start of the U.S. Civil War. There was a lot of economic uncertainty and turmoil, and the stock market reflected that. Well, Neptune was in Pisces, passing across the midheaven of the Nicae at the time. So this is something that we're going to see in 2021 and 2022 as well, because Neptune is so slow. We're going to have 4 eclipses in 2021. There's a total lunar eclipse May 26th at 5 Sag, and according to William Lilly, this represents, and I quote, incursions and rapines of enemies, fraudulent negotiations, many treaties, violent petitions, which I would assume are things like demonstrations, and many missives or letters. This is interesting because we're going to see similar themes throughout the year with the other eclipses. So there's an annular solar eclipse which is named because there's sort of a ring around the sun, as it were. And this is at June 10th at 19 Gemini. So it will conjoin the US Mars in Gemini in the 7th house. So that should be extra fun. I think that given everything going on this spring, we're going to see demonstrations, and according to Lily, many turbulent petitions presented by the people to their superiors and quote-unquote fruitless treaties, so, empty promises. Then we're going to get into the eclipse season of the end of the year, and this is when we start seeing a shift of the eclipses that were occurring in Gemini and Sagittarius into Taurus and Scorpio. So November 19th is a partial lunar eclipse at 27 Taurus. So that's kind of a new thing. We've had Gemini and Sag for a while. So this really represents that shift, right? We're now moving into the Taurus-Scorpio polarity. What's interesting about this particular eclipse is that it's occurring on the malefic fixed star Algol at 26 Taurus. And this decan is also associated with diseases and plague arising from pests. So it's kind of a negative and violent eclipse. I don't particularly like it. I think I'll be very clear about that. I do dislike this one quite a bit. It is followed by a total solar eclipse. This one is going to be in Sagittarius, so kind of rounding out that Sagittarius-Gemini cycle. It'll be December 3rd at 12 Sag. And again, we get demonstrations, many turbulent petitions presented by the people to their superiors, and fruitless treaties. So there you go. Now, I want to kind of take a step back and talk about the eclipses previously and what I think they will mean. The eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius were, I think, visibly tough on the United States during COVID, especially given our angular Mars in Gemini, and I think an overall very strong sensitivity to the Gemini-Sagittarius polarity in general. Just transits through those signs always do things in the US or to the US. So given these eclipses, I think that the US will be roiled to some extent in 2021, although I think that the shift to Taurus and Scorpio relaxes or relieves some of that pressure and moves it elsewhere. And the other thing I get asked about too is just the personal effect of eclipses. I've said this in other videos, specific eclipse dates seem to affect public persons most directly, especially when those people are tied into movements or institutions that started under signs being hit by the eclipse. So the example I always give is, for example, Donald Trump, who was elected under an Aries ingress that had some very strong Sagittarius placements. It had Saturn and Sag on the ascendant in Washington, D.C. What's interesting about that is I think his whole administration and just really his whole persona was very Gemini Sagittarius, which of course matches his own natal chart. And then as these eclipses started happening, he started to run into a lot of political problems and then ultimately lost the US election in 2020. So when you get people who identify because of their natal chart as well as being part of movements that are aligned to certain signs, eclipses in those signs will often take them either to the height or very often they will take them off stage. So I think that's what we'll be seeing, but we're going to see some of those movements of 2016, like Brexit and all that. We're going to start seeing some of that swept away in 2021, even more than it has been, and then something new will take its place toward the end of the year. So the way to think about it is, if you're just a regular person, you're not a politician or some kind of public individual, eclipses can be useful to tell you which houses and which themes are going to be important for that year and a half when eclipses are hitting that particular house polarity. So for example, if you have Gemini or Sagittarius rising, in 2021, we could say that you will be finishing up a cycle of changes that pertain to your identity, your body, as well as your one-on-one relationships, because that's the 7th house. Now, obviously, the 1st and the 7th in your natal chart would be most impacted by these eclipses, but we think of it more as a cycle rather than specific events that always occur on the eclipse. Now, let's take a look at the year quarter by quarter. So, the first quarter, the struggle, as I explained, that we saw between Mars and Saturn continues, but on a different and larger plane. So now we see competition and conflict between groups, movements, and even nations. The first theme that we have going on in the first quarter is the defeat of Mars. In the first 3 weeks, Mars is decisively defeated. If you remember my Mars square Saturn videos, I kept harping on the idea that Mars and Saturn will have been locked in this contest as Mars keeps making repeated squares to Saturn from Aries. Well, the last square happens in Taurus. Saturn will have moved on to Aquarius, Mars is in Taurus. This is their third and final square in this series. So this is really the final and decisive defeat of whatever Mars represented in 2020. So January 6th, Mars will enter Taurus and he'll be there for a couple of months. It's going to be a highly activated period for COVID, as well as this ongoing social Saturn-Uranus conflict. I think we're going to definitely see, a lot of cases, a lot of deaths worldwide, and also a lot of political and social tension. January 13th, Mars will make that square to Saturn at 3 degrees Taurus and Aquarius, respectively. This I would call the final humiliation of Mars. Mars is now in his detriment. He's not even in his own sign. And Saturn, of course, is very powerfully placed in Aquarius, making a superior square to Mars. It's going to be a complete wipeout for Mars. January 20th, though, Mars will conjoin Uranus at 6 degrees Taurus. So I think Mars is going to flame out quite dramatically. There's also what I had mentioned earlier, that Promethean moment of liberation when Prometheus steals fire from the gods, which sets up the conflict really for the rest of 2021. January 17th is when Jupiter will square Uranus at 6 degrees Aquarius and Taurus. And then February 17th is the first time that Saturn will square Uranus at 7 Aquarius and Taurus. So I would say the event or the catalyst is January 17th, Jupiter-Uranus square. That's the theft of fire. Let's do something for the people. But, a month after that, February 17th, Saturn will square Uranus, and now the battle begins. Okay, what are we going to really do? Are we taking this fire? Are we giving it to the people? Do we need to fight for it? That's really it's kind of like the fallout from this first act. I think that on a positive side, though, there will be a lot of new possibilities for a better world opening up from around the time of mid-January's Jupiter square Uranus through mid-February, when Mercury and Venus will conjoin at 14 Aquarius, which is their first of the 4 conjunctions this year. There's also going to be a very sweet, in my opinion, new moon, February 11th, at 23 Aquarius, with Venus conjoining Jupiter. Venus and Jupiter usually only conjoin once a year unless someone is retrograde, but typically to have that exact of an aspect in a new moon really adds a certain hopefulness, it adds a lot of potential, and it adds a lot of possibility to the upcoming 2 weeks. So it's a really neat little opening to make some positive changes on the heels of this Jupiter square Uranus. March 25th is when Venus and the Sun will conjoin in Aries. Venus will be direct, and so it's the beginning of their synodic cycle. So it will really seed events that will become apparent at the end of the year when Venus will go retrograde. So we'll see how well we have done integrating the lessons of Venus of harmony and kindness and tolerance at the end of the year when she goes retrograde, to revisit some of the old ground and see how well we have learned her lessons. The second quarter is, as I called it, euphoria and hysteria. It's kind of an interesting time. It's very different than I think the rest of the year. And it's kind of a moment of levity in, I think, an otherwise pretty serious year. So April 25th, Venus and Mercury will conjoin again at 13 Taurus, and both planets will be direct and Venus will be in domicile. So I think that we're going to see some conflicts around reopening businesses and catering to people's pandemic fatigue. But I think it's going to really come out on the side of, let's open things up again. Hey, things are looking much better. People want to have fun, of course, Venus in Taurus. People want to enjoy, for example, dining and, all those kind of social food events. And Mercury is business, right? So the people in the business are aligned that, yes, we should be having fun right now. Is it the right thing from a health perspective? That's a different issue. April 26th, the very next day, there is a full moon at 7 Taurus that really, I would say, enlivens the Saturn and Uranus square, and battles between movements and empires at this time will really come to the fore. I call this full moon the Empire Strikes Back full moon. The question is which empire? All of them, the big three, right? US, China, and Russia. Saturn square Uranus will be exact again in June, and then it'll get reactivated with Mars entering Leo around that time too. So as soon as, I would say, late April, there's going to be a lot of interesting international, chest beating, as I like to call it. May 13th, Jupiter will enter Pisces, and he'll be there until the end of July. So I see this period as a moment, really a couple of months, of joy and relief after the serious and very reconstruction-oriented Jupiter in Aquarius. The work isn't over, but we get a break, or we take a break, right? For better or for worse, I think for the next couple of months we get more fun and less work. May 23rd, Saturn will also turn retrograde at 13 Aquarius, and then Jupiter will also turn retrograde once he gets to 2 Pisces in June. So, with Saturn going retrograde too, there is this sense like the teacher's not looking, right? Now, I think that people are going to abuse it, and we're going to have to get back to serious work once Q3 rolls around. But for the time being, there's this sense like, yay, be free, let's believe in a better world. That's what Jupiter in Pisces is all about. And then, of course, Saturn is retrograde, so he's not there to kind of like bring down the stick, right? May 29th, Venus and Mercury conjoin again, and they're going to be in Gemini. Mercury is going to be stationary, retrograde, that very day. And there's just a lot of negotiation, I think, around what businesses reopen and which continue to stay limited or closed. There's also a total lunar eclipse a few days before at 5 Sag, so I think there's just going to be a lot of social media intensity. I think probably protests about who gets shut down, who doesn't get shut down. So that's going to be our spring. There is also that annular solar eclipse, June 10th at 19 Gemini, which conjoins the US Mars. So again, that's a very protesty and fighty kind of solar eclipse. And it's definitely going to be felt by the United States. I think it'll be felt internally in the form of protests, but I think it'll also have some pretty strong international ramifications and the US sort of behavior toward and, attempts to reach compromise with with their competitors and allies. The third quarter is what I call the reality check or back to work quarter. Compared to the second quarter, this period feels unexciting and more burdensome. I think some restrictions return, and we have to live with the consequences of the clash of empires. Saturn's going to spend most of the quarter retrograde, so we are back to learning the lessons of the first and second quarters, just to make sure we really got them. And in early July, 1st and 3rd, Mars will oppose Saturn and square Uranus, so triggering that Saturn-Uranus square again. And the Cold War, as I like to call it, gets a little warmer now. And I think it'll also increase COVID cases, because Saturn square Uranus is the pandemic aspect that Mars activates over and over this year. The full moon of July 23rd at 1 Aquarius also reactivates that Saturn-Uranus square, so it's just a heavy month overall. Like July doesn't seem particularly fun. Jupiter also will return to Aquarius from Pisces at the end of the month, so it's kind of back to the hard work of rebuilding after a more euphoric spring and early summer. We're going to get back to thinking about, okay, what is good for the people? What do we need to give people? It's a much more rational and much more grounded Jupiter, paradoxically, even though it's an air sign. In the fourth quarter, I think it's going to be more of a return of real rebuilding and even hope. So Jupiter and Saturn will go direct in Aquarius this quarter, kind of remembering, recollecting their task of rebuilding the world after the last couple of years. Mars will enter Scorpio October 30th, which will make Jupiter and Saturn's task a little bit harder because it adds that conflict, that square. I think Mars will reactivate the Saturn-Uranus square November 10th and 17th because he's making a hard aspect. And I think that process will really culminate December 23rd when Saturn squares Uranus for the last time. This will be bad for COVID case counts, especially as the sun is transiting Scorpio. So I think November particularly is going to be like bad COVID times. Again, we'll see that partial lunar eclipse November 19th at 27 Taurus. And again, it's her first eclipse in Taurus Scorpio, right? I also, in addition to its other characteristics, dislike how it's in hard aspect to Saturn and Uranus. It's bad for the pandemic, and it's bad for international relations and cooperation, which are clearly really needed at this time. There is that total solar eclipse, December 3rd at 12 Sag. Again, we get demonstrations, violent demands to the government, and, some fake promises. Venus will go retrograde too, December 20th in Capricorn. Let's then look back at what happened back in March 2021 when she conjoined the sun in Aries, right? So the seeds that were planted at the start of that synodic cycle will be sprouting. So I think that we could see protests and demonstrations in December again. Now, Jupiter will enter Pisces for good December 28th, 2021, which is a much more hopeful and optimistic and gentle sign than Aquarius. It is the night domicile of Jupiter. So Jupiter is back in his domicile after being in Capricorn, poor thing, and then in Aquarius, which is a bit better. So, Pisces is not as connected to reality as Aquarius. I always think of it as a very religious and spiritual sign. So its interest is in really things of the other world or the next world. But we still will have Saturn and Aquarius to keep us honest, even as Jupiter transits Pisces. I think that generally Jupiter going into Pisces is a much more protective and fortunate note on which to end 2021. I think that the global fight against COVID and just everything associated with it, the poverty, the hunger, all of that, will definitely turn a corner at this time. So 2021 is already much better than 2020, but then here's another step up, right? It's kind of a gradual ascent. I would say that if there is ever a really genuine turning point, it is now. It's at the very end of 2021. So hopefully leaving you with that positive note. It's not going to be a calm and easy and completely problem-free year, but I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity. Because so many decisions get made next year about where do we put our resources individually and collectively, if we want to participate in the conversation, here's our chance to rebuild things the way that we want them, right? It's kind of, if you think about it, it's kind of a rare opportunity. The question is, who gets to make those decisions? I recommend that, we all sort of get involved as much as we can because it's really the only way that we can make a difference. All right, thanks very much for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel.